According to the intelligences communities within Australia, the most dangerous threat to the domestic security of us is right-wing extreme terrorist groups. These groups oppose multicultural freedom and espouse white supremacy notions mixed with ultranationalism. The Constitution originally sought no unity. The Constitution sought exclusively to protect British subjects in Australia through a federal system of governance. And that's not even a criticism, it's just a fact. As proof, the newly federated Australia immediately legislated the White Australia policy referred to, which excluded the non-British and non-Irish people from emigrating to Australia. The legislation specifically determined the flow of immigration based on racial profile, cultural tradition, and ethnicity. Further proof is in the fact that the founding Federalists were economic protectionists, who only sought to pursue economic interests that benefited the Crown. Australia as an outpost would continue to obediently serve the British Empire in the Indo-Pacific, not through loyalty, but through absence of free will or choice. It is in this spirit of justice as a jurisprudential virtue that the following remedies and abiding principles are proposed. The only way the Constitution can establish Australian sovereignty is through a referendum. The referendum will abolish the Crown and replace that power with a directly elected head of state. The head of state must be a president elected by the people, not handpicked through Parliament. Abolishing the Crown and then immediately denying Australians their consent in who should govern, in my opinion, would be a crucial mistake. Self-determination cannot be established through continued domination by oligarchies that invest power among circles of privilege. No aristocracy exists in Australia. Australian Governors General are no longer lords, earls, or members of the British royal family, such as Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester. The proposal that the Prince of Wales become Governor General of Australia was heavily rebuked in the 1970s and then the 1980s by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Australians appear to remain opposed to the interference of the UK in Australian political and sovereign affairs. Appointing British people with knighthoods to senior positions in government or even as vice-chancellors of universities does not appear to be in the best interests of Australians. These behaviours and practices actively deny Australia's right to self-determination, and Australians do not require the aristocratic oversight of the UK in their merit-based social order system. Those facts establish it is crucial to demonstrate why a constitutional change is necessary to reach a remedy. The first principle of constitutional change is a natural argument. Having established that the Constitution is flawed, the most reasonable thing to do is to change what's wrong with it. But the argument is to specifically remove the Crown and replace that power of the sovereign with an elected president. The first reason why this change needs to be made is in the nature of the current system under a constitutional monarchy and its inconsistencies with the wants and desires of the future for Australians. An arbitrary and anachronistic power cannot cohere with the functions of sovereignty or Australian self-determination. Australia faces international opportunities and dilemmas which cannot be addressed with a lack of sovereignty in the affairs pertaining to the discretion of Australians through their government. There is a real risk in the militarised power of other nations to the peace and security of Australia and its entire region. The freedom, prosperity and security of this region and our allies in other nations is a responsibility of Australia through its ANZUS Treaty and the developing AUKUS Pact. The current relationship between Australia and the United Kingdom demands respect for Australians if Australia is to contribute realistically in the arrangements necessary for the security and the development of the Indo-Pacific region. This responsibility should be Australia's because of the geographic realities underpinning any successful strategies to defend other nations as well as our own. Australia's self-determination is now a global obligation because of its agreements. Returning to Australia and its own financial interests at home, a president may wield more power in securing better economic outcomes than the current system falls short of securing under a constitutional monarchy. The Crown, however, is like I've said, it's an arbitrary anachronism. The term at Her Majesty's will and the term at Her Majesty's pleasure are commonly used in reference to the Crown and its Australian legal conventions. The privilege of the Crown designates an arbitrary power. By definition, in the legal and political affairs of Australia, the sovereign exercises discretionary opinion and preference over that of the actual nature of things. Although philosophy, law, and science operate based on proof, argument, rationalism, the Crown need never appeal to any of that reason. An institution is arbitrary if its powers are exercised on the whim or personal privilege of some person who evades scrutiny. A power is arbitrary if it is unrestrained, even at times autocratic. I'm not trying to confuse it with fascism here, but there are a lot of elements of the Crown that are autocratic, that are unchallenged, and that are unscrutinised. And they don't relate to the sovereign as an individual, they relate to everyone who's involved with that system. An institution that is anachronistic is one that draws its authority from outdated customs ill-suited to its times. As an anachronism, the Crown stands irreconcilably as an error imposed on this generation and generation next. Maybe it was suited to a former age. An anachronistic institution is one that creates a disharmonious situation with a contemporary people, place, and time. And those are the Oxford definitions of the words. The Crown is an arbitrary anachronism that imposes its will upon its subjects, regardless of whether Australians have adopted the title of citizen, means nothing to the sovereign. For as long as the Crown imposes its will on Australians, they will always be subjects of its outdated institution, an institution which creates and maintains arbitration where there should be democracy. The Crown does not exist in harmony with the principle of defined and limited powers in New World governments. Perhaps for that reason, abolishing monarchies and transitioning to models of democratic government have been a generational task across the world since century 18. The reason why Australian sovereignty cannot be established through the Crown is simple. The Crown culturally and legally represents powers and social constructs that are inconsistent with Australia's common law. This inconsistency impedes on Australia's social order and its developing merit-based social contract, which is developing. However, I'll entertain the argument of the oppressor. It could be argued that a century of constitutional reform and legislation have made Australia a better nation, and that the injustices are now resolved. If this was the case, the largest single voice calling for the preservation of the Crown in Australia would not be vehemently opposed to any mode of social structural reform. In fact, monarchists consistently oppose multiculturalism and First Nations sovereignty. A First Nations burden of crisis and torment cannot be resolved by monarchists who specifically make the claim that First Nations people are unqualified to speak on the Constitution. That opinion can be sourced from the Australians for Constitutional Monarchies publications and statements. To Australia's monarchists, the very act of a First Nations Australian expressing views about constitutional law and its reform is a radical act. To a rational Australian, it's simply political participation. This particular claim by monarchists is an affront to the high standard of freedom upheld in Australia by its people, if not its current institutions. The Uluru Statement from the Heart immediately establishes truth-telling through a series of facts that make the case for change. According to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, First Nations Australians have an abnormally high mortality and incarceration rate. Such low health outcomes cannot be the result of simply systemic racism, but active racism, which has yet to be effectively reconciled. What is more alarming is the rate at which First Nations children are incarcerated. Obscenely high youth incarceration points to a lack of government decisions. Governments who have denied First Nations young people their right to determine their own futures. If the Crown was a just institution, something would have been done to resolve these injustices. However, this could not have been possible because the Crown is arbitrary. The Crown limits freedoms and operates without scrutiny in any decisions made by the sovereign. The choice to do nothing is one side of what makes the Crown an unjust, ill-suited, institution for Australia. The other injustice is the imposition it places on those who would do something had only they the power to do it. If the power ordained in the Crown was able to stand resolute as an institution that served Australians, there would be minimal limits to the freedom of subjects to act independently. This independence is characteristic of citizens, not subjects. At the very least, justice would have been sought through the Crown regarding the lack of voice in the self-determination of all Australians. There's not a single grist of evidence that any of these thoughts or intentions have been the aspirations of any United Kingdom sovereign since the arrival of English government, law, or philosophies in Australia. Not once.